Hello all, Jules here again from Live to 100. So I had a patient recently who came to me with unbearable itching all over her legs and her feet. And it triggered me into a thought that I think more people have problems with histamine intolerance than one would actually think. So I want to do a talk on histamine intolerance, and you can have a look at the signs and symptoms and see whether or not any of these apply to you. For those of you who don't know me, you can just stop the recording at this point and read through, but I'm not going to go through it in detail because most of my listeners do know me. I want to jump straight into histamine intolerance. Please read the disclaimer. I just want to point out that the information presented here is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any medical condition. Please, it's not intended to replace your relationship with your medical doctor. So if you have any medical conditions, please see your doctor. Now, you can see from this list that there's a very wide range of symptoms that are associated with histamine intolerance. Of course, some of these symptoms are associated with other conditions, but if you have, I would say, a couple of these symptoms, then looking at histamine as a cause is definitely worth doing because it's a root cause of these problems, and just taking medication to suppress the symptoms is actually not helpful. You can really look at what is the foundational cause, and one can ameliorate that, and then the other symptoms tend to go away as well. So very common ones: itchy skin, headaches, a flushed face, especially after drinking wine, constantly rhinitis, runny nose, eczema. That can be eczema on the face or eczema anywhere in the body, actually. Bloating, so gut bloating, any conditions, diagnosed conditions like ulcerative colitis or even IBS. If you have a shortness of breath or rapid heartbeat, in actual fact, sometimes after eating certain foods, people who are severely histamine intolerant can have rapid heartbeat, shortness of breath, so much so that they need to be hospitalized. Sudden drop in blood pressure, in other words, it can even cause fainting. Orthostatic hypertension, which is basically when you are in a hot bath or you're sitting down and you get up suddenly and you faint or you feel faint. Motion sickness is a sign or symptom of histamine intolerance. Constant sneezing, so a lot of coldy symptoms. Diarrhea or constipation because it affects the gut very profoundly. Asthma, any vomiting or nausea after eating certain foods. Generalized chronic fatigue and anxiety, and in some cases irregular menstrual cycle. Now, in a lot of situations, the signs and symptoms tend to come after eating certain foods, but they may not be immediate because it takes food a little bit of time to be processed. So what's so difficult in some cases to diagnose histamine intolerance is because the signs and symptoms might be a little bit delayed, and then it's hard to associate them with certain foods that you've been eating. So what exactly is histamine? We've all heard the word histamine. Histamine is a compound, and it works like a messenger or signal in the body. So it tells the body when there's a problem. So let's say, for example, you sprain your ankle and you get that pain and the redness and the swelling that's associated with the sprained ankle. Histamine plays a role in this. So it's the primary messenger that's released into the body that's going to activate the immune system or even activate healing to a certain degree. And as I said, it plays a role in that heat and swelling and pain that follows any damage to the body. Now, because histamine is necessary in order to message the body when there's some kind of a problem or the body's under attack. So, for example, as well, let's say you are sensitive to pollen. Pollen for your body is a foreign object. So when you breathe in pollen, the body perceives itself as being under attack, and histamine is going to be released. But because it's the primary messenger, histamine is present in nearly all the tissues within our body. So it's in the lining of the gut, it's in the nerves, it's in all your white blood cells. And when there's a lot of histamine, or the histamine receptors are overactive, which really has the same result in the body, it then overexcites all of these tissues, or all the cells that contain histamine, with that response. And so in the nerves, it can dilate the blood vessels, it can overstimulate the immune complexes, and the result of this is any or most or all of the signs and symptoms that I've already mentioned. Now, in a normal body, once the histamine has been released and the body has worked with the histamine, it's now time for the histamine to clear. A normal body will clear the histamine at a reasonable rate. So it breaks up the histamine. But in histamine intolerant people, the histamine accumulates. And when the histamine accumulates, you get the accompanying very, very unpleasant signs and symptoms. Now, obviously in a normal body, when your body's use the histamine, when it's released the histamine and now it's time to clear it, a body that's functioning properly is able to clear the histamine properly. And it does this using two enzymes. Enzymes are extremely important. In fact, the enzymes are the workhorses in the body. So these enzymes are produced in the intestines, and there are two main ones. One is called diamine oxidase, so DAO for short, and the other one is called histamine N-methyltransferase, so HNMT for short. And these enzymes, as I said, they're produced in the intestines, and when the body's done with the histamine, they break up the histamine. But if your DAO or your HNMT are not working properly, the histamine backs up, a little bit like a bottleneck in a river. And then you get it's an overflow really of the histamine, and it affects all the histamine receptors in all of our tissues. So if you think, as I said, we've got histamine receptors in pretty much all of our organs and all of our tissues. And when you looked at the range of those symptoms, you could see the range is very wide. And that's because if there's an overflow of histamine triggering the histamine receptor sites on all of our tissues, really, you can actually get a histamine response in pretty much anywhere in the body. And even our gut bugs, so our resident gut bugs, can cause a problem because our resident gut bugs produce histamine, and supplements like probiotics, for example, are also very high in histamine. So in a person who's not struggling with these DAO and HNMT, they can clear the histamine very easily. But for people who are not, if they take probiotics, for example, probiotics are normally so healthy, but not in a person who's histamine intolerant. Now, what are the sort of factors that add to histamine load? So, as I mentioned, our resident gut bugs, probiotics, foods that are very high in histamine, and I'm going to go through some of those foods a little bit later on. Any fermented foods, so again, something like kombucha or sauerkraut or pickles, all of these are problems because they are very high in histamine, and your body's not clearing it properly. And if you've got certain gene SNPs in DAO or HNMT. Now, what a gene SNP is, our genes that we inherit are like the blueprints that make up our proteins, of which the enzymes are very necessary proteins that our genes will give us the blueprints to make up these proteins. Now, what happens is that we inherit as humans about 20 to 25,000 different gene sequences for our proteins. But if there's a small variation on any of the genes, they're not mutations. We just call them variations. And every single human being has got probably 1 million of these variations. And some are more common than others. And if you've got a variation on the gene that makes up the diamine oxidase or the HNMT, then the DAO and the HNMT don't work as well, and your body can't break down histamine at the same rate as somebody who doesn't have those gene SNPs. So I want to just go into a little bit more of an explanation about what histamine is. Histamine is a normal compound in the body, and it's made from an amino acid. Now, amino acids are building blocks of protein, and the amino acid is called histidine. So what happens is the body uses another enzyme, so you can see how important enzymes are, and this enzyme is called histidine decarboxylase, and this enzyme converts the histidine into histamine, and then it's stored in the mast cells. Mast cells are like balloons. They just float around all over the place in the body, and so all the histamine that's created is then stored in the mast cells, waiting for when it's needed. Histamine is also stored in the basophils, the platelets, and in neurons, and it's also very plentiful in the mucosal cells of the gut. And this is why very often when you have a histamine intolerance, the gut has a lot of the symptoms. So as soon as a trigger, so that could be an immune response, it could be damage, releases the histamine from the particular storage component wherever it's stored, the histamine then attaches to the receptors that are located all over the body. So these receptors are called, there are 4 of them, H1 to H4. And once the receptor receives the histamine, it's going to manifest a particular response in that organ or tissue. And it depends on the organ or the tissue as to what the response is going to be. So if it's in the mucous membranes, of course, you're going to get the snuffles and the sneezes. If it's in the gut, you can get a lot of bloating or constipation or diarrhea. In the nerves, you could get headaches, or you could also get motion sickness. So all of these signs and symptoms will come out if there's histamine attached to them. Now, as I said to you before, the body, once the histamine is sort of used up, the body needs to break it down. And it uses 2 enzymes to break it down. So the one enzyme is called histamine N-methyltransferase, and the other enzyme is called diamine oxidase. So the histamine N-methyltransferase works inside the cell, and in order for the HNMT to actually work, it needs a methyl group to attach to it. Now, methyl groups are very important in the body. They're carbons it's a carbon with 3 hydrogens attached. And basically what they do, they work like switches. They turn things on and off. They turn metabolic processes on and off in the body. So for HNMT to work, it needs a methyl group to attach to it. Now, certain people are poor methylators. And when they're poor methylators, they don't have enough methyl groups to break up histamine. So sometimes you can be fine genetically on the HNMT and the DAO, but you're a low methylator, and then your body doesn't have enough methyl groups and it doesn't trigger the breakdown of histamine. Now, HNMT works inside the cell, and it handles approximately 60 to 70% of the total histamine volume. And with methylation as a separate process, it needs particular cofactors. And this is why if you are struggling with what you suspect is histamine intolerance, you do need to go and see a functional medicine practitioner or a practitioner who's experienced not only with gene SNPs, but also with histamine and with methylation, those sort of processes, because without that knowledge, they won't be able to help you adequately. They'll probably just put you onto antihistamines. Now, DAO works outside the cell, and it's responsible for breaking down the food. It deals with the gut microbes, and it works with about 20 to 30% of the histamine. So normally when you are histamine intolerant, you can affect a change if you just work with DAO, and because even reducing the volume of histamine by about 20 to 30% will definitely help you feel a lot better. But because there are quite a few factors, so there's the HNMT as a factor, there's DAO as a factor, there's the sensitivity of the histamine receptors. Some people have very sensitive histamine receptors. That's a factor, and whether or not you're a poor or a good methylator. These are all factors that could predispose towards problems with histamine. So what are the other factors that might affect the efficacy of DAO? One of them is alcohol. So not only is alcohol a fermented beverage, which causes a problem because it already carries a lot of histamine, but also alcohol affects the lining of the gut. And when the lining of the gut is affected, DAO is not as efficient. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatories are similar to alcohol in that they affect the lining of the gut, and then DAO is not effective enough. Dysbiosis, so if you have problems with the ratios of your gut bugs. Certain gut bugs are higher histamine producers than other gut bugs, and obviously in a situation like this, you want to balance the high histamine gut bug producers with the low histamine gut bug producers. There are some gut bugs that will help to break down the histamine. Stress causes a lot of gut problems as well, so it reduces the efficacy of your gut response. Certain medications, so for example, there are actually quite a few medications that do affect the efficacy of DAO, but codeine is one of them and naproxen is another one, and even some antihistamines. So when you are prescribed antihistamines to reduce your histamine response, some of the antihistamines, they diminish the efficacy of the enzyme DAO. Now, how do you go about treating histamine intolerance? As I said to you, you need to see somebody who actually understands gene SNPs and how you can get your gene SNPs checked, because you can see whether or not you've got problems with DAO and HNMT. A practitioner who understands methylation as well, because it's not enough to just have a look at the gene SNPs. You need to also have a look at the methylation processes in the body. Giving antihistamines, it is effective. It will bring down that histamine response. But how antihistamines work is that they just block the H1 to H4 receptor sites. So they don't treat the root cause. In other words, why do you have a sensitivity to histamine in the first place? So the best approach is to go into an elimination plan, a low histamine food elimination plan. You can add vitamin C and garlic. Both vitamin C and garlic are natural antihistamines. You need to add methyl support, something that is going to promote the methylation or promote the production of methyl groups in the body. You'll need to discuss that with a practitioner. And you need to assess any medication you're on to see whether or not that inhibits the DAO. Foods that are high in histamine, wine and spirits, all wine and all spirits. Any old food. So you need to create food, make food fresh and eat it fresh, and don't save it in the fridge. Fish is very, very high in histamine. So if you're going to eat fish, it almost needs to be literally out of the sea and onto your plate to make sure that the histamine levels are low. Aged cheeses, any pickled foods. Bananas and strawberries are interesting because one would think that they are, as fruits, they should be healthy, and they are healthy, but they are histamine producers. Any citrus fruit is high in histamine. Fish and shellfish I've mentioned, and some vegetables. Broccoli, for example, is actually quite high in histamine. So if you've got any problems with these, you're welcome to contact me. You can email me on health@livetoa100.co.za, or you can go and have a look at the website, www.livetoa100.co.za. And thanks so much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed the talk.